Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's webinar. First things first, a bit of housekeeping from our side. You will notice that you are muted for the duration of today's webinar. However, if you have any questions or comments at any point, please do feel free to log these in the little question box on the GoToWebinar pop-up, or just comment to let me know something. And I'll be more than happy to tackle these at the end of today's session. You'll also be sent a link to view the recording afterwards as well. So today we're going to be talking about how data privacy and protection fits into today's world. We are more connected than ever, with more ways of storing and transmitting information than ever before. We have to ensure that we are providing just as many ways of protecting this information wherever it goes. My name is Chris Unwin. I'm a Redgate employee of 3 years, currently data privacy specialist, article writer, and infamous co-host of the Redgate DBAL podcast, available on iTunes and Spotify. And I will be your host for today's webinar. So a little bit about Redgate before we start. Why are we hosting this for you? Well, there's quite a few of us, 230 and counting, probably closer to around 250 to 260 now. We're about 18 years old, and we have, several 100,000 customers around the globe. And that's just customers who've bought the tools, and not just people who are using the tools. There are many, many more of those as well. Now, we actually really like to practice what we preach, and we go to everyone saying, hey, the benefits of DevOps on your development process, yeah, absolutely. But we do practice what we preach, and we have had just over 1,100 product releases in the last year alone. So we're really going hell for leather on delivering that value to our own end users. Now, a company's data is one of its most valuable and important resources. Managing and protecting that data are massive responsibilities, and now more than ever, a data governance process just has to be put into place to avoid misuse and to meet those regulatory requirements. And of course, complying with those regulatory requirements is just getting harder and harder. There are more and more regulations that we're having to comply with. So we came across this quote from Dr. Larry Ponemon, who is the chairman and founder of the Ponemon Institute, a research think tank dedicated to advancing privacy, data protection, and information security practices. Dr. Ponemon is considered a pioneer in privacy auditing and the responsible information management framework. Now, this quote really brings home the detrimental impact of a data breach or leak, and also for how long the damaging effects can last. Notice the quote doesn't specifically call out financial ramifications, but we can imply from it that there is much wider scope as to the impact on organizations. In the most recent times, some of these hard-hitting data breaches in the healthcare sector, it just reveals how many ways our data can be put at risk. So a recent example, the State Department of Developmental Services in Sacramento, which oversees the state centers and regional non-profits that serve Californians who have developmental disabilities like cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and autism. So they, in February, were ransacked by vandals who stole 12 government computers and briefly had access to the personal health records of 582,000 people. The group also had access to personal information regarding around 15,000 state employees, contractors, job applicants, and of course the parents of minors enrolled into the department's programs. So it's clear to see we're not just talking about IP addresses or other PII, we're talking about directly sensitive information of those who are potentially the most at risk. Another example, but this time in Norway, in January 2018, hackers breached the systems of Southern and Eastern Norway Regional Health Authority and possibly made off with personal information and health records of some 2.9 million Norwegians. 2.9 million, I'll just let you take that in for a second. So Norwegian public healthcare is actually divided into several regions, and the health records found here most likely included that of government and secret police employees, military intelligence staff, politicians, and other public individuals. Although there was lots of speculation on the motivation for this attack, it could just as easily turn out that the attackers were merely after data which they can sell on to the highest bidder. So having looked at some of these recent breaches, it really illustrates the inconvenience and high cost of the data breaches in this particular sector. Healthcare data breach costs are the highest among all surveyed sectors for the 7th straight year, according to the 2017 Cost of a Data Breach study. That survey was sponsored by IBM Security and conducted by the Ponemon Institute. So the average cost of a data breach is $3.62 million globally, which is a 10% decline from the 2016 survey. However, healthcare data breaches cost organizations $380 per record on average, which is more than 2.5 times the global average across other industries at around $141 per record. So it's clear to see the trend downwards doesn't quite fit in the healthcare sector. And given the nature of the data we're supposed to be protecting, that's unsurprising. So if we take a look at some of the causes, malicious or criminal attacks were the primary cause of data breaches in the US, according to this survey. So these types of attacks accounted for around 52% of incidents, with human error and system glitches each accounting for 24%. Malicious attacks were the costliest type of data breach as well. Companies with a data breach due to malicious or criminal attacks had an average per capita data breach cost of $244. So in contrast, system glitches or human error as the root cause had per capita costs significantly below the mean, around $209 and $200 respectively. Comparatively, having an incident response plan and team in place, extensive use of encryption, employee training, business continuity involvement, and of course extensive use of data loss prevention technologies were combined found to reduce data breach costs by more than $9 per compromised record. But what kinds of tools and methods do we have at our disposal to tackle the problem of sensitive data being breached? Well, data encryption and pseudonymization is considered an addressable requirement under HIPAA regulations. So covered entities, that's anyone storing PHI, can determine through their own risk analysis if data encryption is necessary for their operations. So should data encryption be found not to be necessary, the organization still needs to document its reasoning for that, and then also implement an appropriate option in its place. By making sensitive information unreadable, covered entities could make it more difficult for unauthorized parties to access that data. Even if a network was accessed or a mobile device was stolen, the translation card or key would also need to be taken. So the US Department of Health and Human Services, or the HHS, they stated that valid encryption processes for data at rest and data in motion are consistent with NIST standards. Now in the US, NIST are the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So with the healthcare industry averaging the highest cost per stolen record, data encryption and pseudonymization could both be viable options to organizations looking to find applicable breach prevention measures. But it's not just the US who have to worry about how they're protecting PHI or indeed any sensitive information. Let's take a look at the laws around the world. So from a more global view, this graphic is from global law firm DLA Piper's Data Protection Laws of the World Handbook. Quite a mouthful, I know, but the first edition was launched in 2012, and it actually sets out an overview of the key privacy and data protection laws and regulations across nearly 100 different jurisdictions. It states that they continue to witness a period of unprecedented activity in the development of data protection regulation around the world, which will have a profound impact on the way in which global businesses are required to approach the collection and management of personal information. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but it's kind of echoing the sentiments of several of the other legislations that we've seen. So these changes themselves are actually being driven largely by cultural and trade considerations and by a struggle to keep pace with emerging technologies and online business methods. So recently, much has been made of the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, aka the GDPR, and that became enforceable on the 25th of May this year. However, some data protection laws around the world have for some time been evolving and maturing to protect the rights of the individual. So this slide is just a small snapshot illustrating what some jurisdictions define as personal data, and more so what is sensitive personal data. So in the US, there are around 20 national privacy or data security laws, including HIPAA. In Canada, one of the primary statutes is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA. Obviously, in Australia, data privacy and protection is currently made up of a mix of federal and state territory legislation. And then in South Korea, a law relating to the protection of personal information, unsurprisingly called the Personal Information Protection Act, or PIPA, was enacted and became effective in 2011. So welcome to the new world of data privacy and protection, if you can excuse the pun. So compliance is just going to continue to drive data governance from a technology issue onto board agendas. Drivers for this change include legislation like HIPAA, as we've seen, and many other inevitable new data regulations around the world that are even yet to come, like the Privacy Shield. In a recent survey that we ran here at Redgate, over 500 SQL Server professionals responded and gave us an indication of how they handle the technical and business challenges of data governance in their organizations. So let's just have a brief look at some of the findings we found as part of this report. So the actual respondents of the survey were from across the globe and represented a wide range of job roles. Company sizes and industries, of course, were included as well. So among some of the key findings, we did find that 72% of those respondents actually worked in organizations that were subject to legislation or regulations such as SOX or HIPAA. There was around 64% of respondents who said adopting a DevOps approach to their software development was beneficial to their data governance program, and only 5% said it had a negative impact. And one of the most interesting things that I found from here is that of those who indicated they were running successful or very successful data governance programs, they were using around 11 different tools on average. And when you take a look at some of the unsuccessful and very unsuccessful programs, they were only using around 5. So as you'd expect, the main drivers for implementing a data governance program were regulation and compliance. And following up from that, it was to improve business intelligence and analytics. Of those who implemented a data governance program, around 91% in total found it to have at least some degree of success. So for those who were unsuccessful or very unsuccessful, the main drivers were to decrease customer risk and improve business intelligence and analytics, but none of the unsuccessful implementations were driven by regulation and compliance. So that leads us into thinking there's some kind of tight coupling going on between this reason. So most interestingly, of those who were successful and very successful, 62% had implemented some standards and control objectives. Notably, 72% also adopted a DevOps approach across their software projects and felt that DevOps had a positive impact on data governance. So it's clear for us to see it's not just about having encryption or pseudonymization of data at rest, but we need to have appropriate processes in place at every single level to protect this data. So data governance is sometimes seen to conflict with DevOps, as the speed of change associated with DevOps can be seen as a risk. However, 64% of the survey respondents said a DevOps approach to the database had a positive impact on data governance. And this is likely because DevOps introduces managed processes that actually simplify compliance by enabling software to be delivered in a consistent, reliable and repeatable way, and by providing an audit trail of changes made and, for example, deployments. So of the respondents that had a successful or very successful data governance program, 72% felt DevOps approach to the database had a positive impact as well. So this is a really good time, I think, to get some input from you all, given that we're covering how companies put in place relevant processes for data. What we want to do is better understand how you guys out there are actually looking after your own data. So what we're going to do is launch a very quick poll for you all to fill in. So that should come up now. So please feel free to pop in your answers, let them fly in fast and furiously. And riddle me this: where does the data in your development, QA and test environments come from? So I'll give you a couple of seconds just to get those answers in. We do have a few coming. Okay, brilliant. Right, I'm going to close this down now then. Perfect. So overwhelmingly, it seems that of those attending today's webinar, most people are using a copy of production. Now, that's unsurprising. And if we take a look at how the results came in the actual survey that Redgate ran, well, when it came to using data in non-production environments, around 61% of respondents used a copy of production data. So as you can see, the majority, much like we have today. With 72% of respondents having to comply with regulations, we may have expected to see more organizations masking data or using synthesized data in non-production. So I should point out this was a multiple choice question, which suggests that a copy of production may only be used in certain scenarios, for example, for testing or diagnostics. But 35% of respondents who used data in non-production environments only used a copy of production. This percentage does shift somewhat when you filter by industry, but 35% is still a very, very high number. The lowest percentages only using a copy of production in non-production environments were in IT services and consulting, financial services and insurance, and the medical and pharmaceutical organizations as well. But what does it actually mean for us having duplicated sensitive data opening up our attack surface area? How does it affect development and other processes happening around this data once we have it sat in pre-production? Well, manual processes impact every single stage of our software delivery. Now, as an example, both the EU's GDPR and the US's HIPAA specify to some extent that you have a general obligation to implement technical and organizational measures which show that you have considered and integrated some sort of data protection activity into your processing. So this is one of my favorite phrases: data protection by design and by default. So having a process in place that is reliable and repeatable actually gives you a good foundation from which to build your own defensible position around data privacy and protection. So whether it's tracking changes to the underlying tables in which the data is stored, or monitoring the databases and servers where these tables are stored, DevOps and compliance actually go hand in hand to ensure that you're able to deliver value to end users and customers, of course, without compromising on good data protection practices or vice versa. So what can you do to ensure that your database development process is secure and compliant? Well, at Redgate, we would recommend that you start by answering these 4 questions to start that journey to a compliant DevOps process. So the first question: where is your data? Do you know where it is? Now, this seems like a fairly inane question. It seems like, well, of course I know where my data is. But we're not just talking about our production data on our production databases on our main servers. We're talking potentially about a copy of production that was stored in a backup and then moved to some other file location. We could be talking about a test copy of the database that was spun up when a developer or a tester needed a copy and then was subsequently forgotten about. Can we say with absolute certainty we've gone out and found exactly where we have all of our data? And this is the basis for understanding the next few questions. Now, once we've understood exactly where our data is, we need to identify what it is. If 100% of our data is useless, headless financial data maybe that doesn't pertain to any living individual, then we might be good to go. But it could be something a bit more nefarious than that. It could be personally identifiable or protected health information. The last thing we want is for data to exist out in the open that hasn't yet been classified, and we haven't built up our own data catalog, as it were. Once we understand where all of our data is and what it is, it's then easier to ensure that we are going about protecting it in the best possible way. Who accesses your data and for what purpose? Now, most of the legislations we've been talking about today calls out specifically controlling access where necessary, so that only relevant people should have access to that data. But of course, people move teams. Some people are given temporary access that's not revoked. There's lots of different ways that access control can get out of hand. And in some cases, we speak to people where they say, well, I just give all of my developers access because I trust them. And trust is absolutely key, but you do need to know what processing activities are taking place and who is accessing that particular data, should they be accessing that data. Finally, how can you demonstrate adequate protection? So putting in place protective boundaries and putting in place these controls and processes doesn't just stop there. We also need to be able to prove to the business, to our customers, to auditors, that we are taking adequate steps to protect all of their information, whether this is outputting reports, whether this is, as I say, building up a data catalog, so we can say we know exactly where our data is. We know this section over here is sensitive information. We then limit access to that information, and then we have protective boundaries in place to help us ensure that that data isn't being duplicated and that we're not exposing an asset through a vulnerability. So in fact, with a little more thought and some help from the right tooling, it's a relatively simple process to extend our previous diagram to include the relevant tasks and actually complete the cycle. So here once again, we have a version deployed to production. We actually keep monitoring that environment to detect any loss of access or odd behavior. We then also have a backwards chain that allows us to take the environment as a source and provision dev and test environments as copies that have had any sensitive data removed as part of the process. Let's take a little look at these two stages a little more closely and highlight where these Redgate tools potentially are adding value. So the provisioning of database copies to improve the efficiency and quality of database development and testing is increasingly common as companies and organizations seek to introduce DevOps practices. Working with a copy of production enables developers to find errors faster and prevent problems when changes are deployed. It does, however, take a long time and huge amounts of disk space to provision copies. So older copies are often used, which become increasingly unreliable over time and are actually difficult to keep track of, especially where multiple developers are involved. So let's take a look at what Redgate have brought to market to solve this particular issue. So today, for the purposes of provisioning some databases for my developers, we're going to be using the forums-redgate-com database. Now, this is my development SQL server, and you can see here that I have a previous version here, a backup and restored copy of this particular database. Now, this is obviously taking up the same amount of space that production would. It's taking a fair amount of time. A developer is making a request of me to restore this database, and that request is sitting in a queue until I'm able to get to it, creating a bottleneck in work. We then also have the very minor issue of all of this personally identifiable information that exists in this table as well. You can see potentially some famous faces here in Grant Fritchie and Steve Jones. And what we want to do is actually make sure that we are protecting Grant and Steve's data as we move them back into pre-production. So let's do away with this old world and minimize our forums-redgate-com dev environment. And what we're going to do is make use of SQL provision. Now, SQL provision consists of two main parts. That's the masking component and the cloning component. Now, if we open up the masking component, you'll see what we have specified here as a few rules on how to protect the information in the table. Now, I have a controller linked up to a copy of the forums-redgate-com database. And you can see we've got two rules specified as part of our masking run. In the substitution rule, we're essentially taking the information in the table itself. So our columns say contact full name, and we're replacing this with a data set or replacing it with a fresh value, something that looks realistic, but ultimately not something that can be reverse engineered. And that's because it's being taken out randomly and replaced. We then also have a row internal rule. And what this is doing is essentially taking the first name and last name from the contacts table and then putting them together with a random dictionary word and also a second level domain. So we could end up with something like chris.unwin@happiness.localhost. Yes, it still looks representative of the name we will have masked in the table, so it's still useful for bug hunting and trying to surface information in pre-production, and it still looks relevant. But ultimately, if we accidentally send a test email to any one of these addresses, it will never go to a living individual. Now, once we've defined these rules, we can then save this down in what we call a .dms mask set. But how do we consume that masking set? How do we protect information anytime it comes out of production? Well, fortunately, this is where the cloning portion of SQL provision comes in. You'll see here that I have a couple of what we call SQL clone images. Now, SQL clone depends on two key concepts. the SQL clone image, and the SQL clone clone. Not a very creative naming convention, I will admit, but it gets the job done. So essentially, the image is a fixed point in time representation of a database taken from a live SQL Server database or from a backup. And then this image is written to a Windows file share. From here, we spin up what we call differencing disks or clones on hosts where we need to consume that information. Now, because these clones are dependent on that original image on the file share, that is where most of the information is stored, the schema and the data. And the clones themselves just being differencing disks that we can work on like as if they were full copies of the database are only the differences and are therefore very, very small and very quick to spin up. Now, the way we apply that masking set to this process is by creating an image, say, for example, from a live SQL Server. And what we can do as part of this workflow is actually define any modifications that should be made during the process. Now, this could be our masking set file, the one we just put together, or it could also be a SQL script as well if we need to make any pre-image modifications, like changing around some of the user permissions. Now, instead of clicking through, one of the best features within SQL Provision is its automatic capability, how we can actually bring about automation of provisioning. And this is all that backwards direction that you saw with the previous slide. Now, all I have is 22 short lines of PowerShell. And the PowerShell commandlets that we need actually come pre-packaged up with SQL clone. Now, Provision is going to allow us to create an image from our backup file, as you can see highlighted here. And that's the backup from our production database. We then also have a new SQL clone mask, that .dms mask set that we saw. And then we're telling SQL Provision to create us some new development databases for Chris, Becky, and Louise, as well as a testing database and a QA database as well. So we can go ahead and kick this process off. And if we jump back into SQL Clone, you'll see that it's now started creating that image for us, preparing the disk image. Now it's going to sit at 1% for just a moment because it's taking from a backup, so it's doing all the necessary preparations. And then what it will do is it will actually flick up to around 80% where it will run the modifications, that .dms mask set. From there on, the image itself will be finalized and put onto the Windows file share. Now this means that none of the data is actually accessible until it has been masked and reached that file share. This is important because we don't want production level data leaving that particular boundary. We would just prefer that it was masked en route to the image, which is exactly what is happening here. And then we can create our clones from here to work on. Now this process could run overnight if we wanted to. We could prepare all of our development and testing databases, say at the beginning of every week or every month, depending on how often we want to refresh those databases. But ultimately, it's down to process, it's down to what you prefer. And SQL Provision can actually create all of these environments for us to work from. Now you'll see that we already have a Dev Chris database, a Dev Becky database. We're already on the third, and this is spinning up so much quicker than we could restore all of these copies of the database. Now, it's important to note that it looks a bit like the space saving is 102 meg down to 46 megabytes, but actually it doesn't matter the size of the image. So this could be 102 gigabytes, it could be 10.2 terabytes. And the clone databases themselves will still only be about 50 megabytes in size. Now, because they're all hanging off of the production image here, and you can see it's been modified with that masking set, we are all inheriting protected pseudonymized data. From an audit perspective, we can see exactly where we're putting all of our information, for example, where it's located, who created it, when it was created, and we can use this information in case we get audited and they wonder where we're putting all of our development databases. Now, if I jump back over into Management Studio and refresh those databases, what we'll see is that we now have, alongside the old and inefficient copy of the database, we now have Becky, Chris, Louise, QA, testing. We've got all of our architecture set up to go. Now I can open up Louise's environment, for example, and we can take a look at one of the tables in here. And instead of seeing Grant and Steve as we did before, we still get a realistic view of our production data because we've retained a certain usefulness, a certain demographic, and a certain style. And now where we had Grant and Steve, we have Bobby and Carly and Bridget, and they all have realistic email addresses as well. So what was the actual provisioning impact in DevOps there? Well, to sum it up, the SQL provision actually supports a database DevOps approach whilst keeping compliance entirely central to this process. With the virtual cloning technology, we've spun up databases in seconds using very little storage and allowing for isolated development and testing. The sensitive data has been completely pseudonymized and replaced with realistic data. And with this single central management system for all of this process, it becomes simple, repeatable, transparent, and auditable. All of those benefits from DevOps that we mentioned beforehand. As we've seen from an earlier slide of the research we conducted on provisioning, 83% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that it's desirable to use production data in development and testing. Well, now they can continue to do so, knowing that data security, regulatory compliance, and storage concerns have been accommodated. So what's the other side of that coin? We've talked about the benefits of a DevOps approach to delivering changes up the pipeline. We've talked about a DevOps approach for compliance coming back down the pipeline and actually creating these relevant environments. But SQL Server estates are growing, and as we take on managing some of these additional instances both in-house and get third parties involved. So how do we actually monitor this SQL Server estate and be assured that although we've got the going up the pipeline and coming back down the pipeline taken care of, are we always one step ahead whilst protecting the data as it sits in production? Again, let's take a quick look at how Redgate tackled this particular problem. So this is Redgate's SQL Monitor, and as you can see in the top, if you would like to go and see SQL Monitor running for yourself, you can go to monitor.red-gate.com. And what Monitor gives us is a single central pane of glass through which we can manage all of our instances of SQL Server. Now we can see at a nice high level exactly what is healthy, what exists in a warning state, what's critical, and lots of people will have this up on a monitor in the office to try and catch problems before they even occur. Using SQL Monitor, we can drill down into any of these instances to see exactly what is affecting that particular instance at any given point in time. Now, when I say point in time, I mean literally point in time. We can look at how the machines are how they're performing right now, or we can drill back to a particularly problematic time in that instance's life. Now, as you can see here, what's happened is SQL Monitor has raised alerts that the behavior has been, well, let's go with odd. We have a number of alerts raised on this timeline here where we saw some of our key metrics, our CPU, memory, disk I/O, and weights actually going off the scale. Now we can drill down further into this by moving the window back to that particular alert time, and that will actually update all of the necessary graphs and information below this graph. You can see on the alerts on the right that we actually had a bunch of deadlocks raised on this instance. And we can start drilling down into some of these alerts and actually saying, well, what was happening at the time? What sorts of queries did we have running? What sorts of waits did we have running? And we can drill down further into those queries if we want by saying, let's see the query execution plan, or let's see some static analysis for how we improve that query. But gradually we just go down, we drill down as far as we need to diagnose issues with that machine to ensure we don't lose availability of our sensitive information, and obviously to catch that odd behavior. Now, if we take a look at, for example, our estate tab as well. Now, most recently, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, or ICO, actually came out and said that failure to patch software that results in a data breach means that you, the company storing, controlling that information, can be liable. Now, obviously, one of the main blights of the healthcare industry can be making sure that software is up to date. And if we look down in the estate management tab within Monitor, we're able to keep an eye on all of the versions of our SQL Server, what the latest available updates are, what the status is, and when the end of mainstream support is going to be. And this just allows us to stay on top of everything within our environments to make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect that data. Now, SQL Monitor alerts you on these performance boundaries that you can set and that you can customize within Monitor. But of course, what you can do is also define your own metrics. So we have a website called SQLMonitorMetrics.com, which is where Microsoft MVPs, Redgaters, people in the community, other people using SQL Monitor actually contribute their own metrics for people to pull into Monitor and use. And many of these have privacy tags alongside them, such as tracking when a backup goes to an unusual location. Now, you can be alerted on all of these different metrics, whether they're pre-built in or some of these custom ones that you can build or download yourself. And even from there, once we're getting alerted on them and making sure that the relevant people are being notified that we're having issues in any of our production environments, we can also put together the appropriate reports as well. If we move to, say, a 28-day view of our estate, we can see that actually all of our production nodes have had 100% uptime, which is absolutely perfect. But this is where we get asked the difficult questions. When people say, can you show us that you've had access to this sensitive information at all times? Or what has the performance of these SQL servers been like? How many alerts have been raised on our most sensitive production instances? These are all things that can be aggregated into this single view and provided to the relevant stakeholder or auditor, for example. Now, Monitor is a hugely powerful tool, not only for performance tuning and spotting these oddities, but also just for giving you a nice holistic overview of exactly what is happening on your estate so that you can stay one step ahead of the problem. So in another recent survey we conducted, the state of SQL Server monitoring, we found that 47% of respondents expected their SQL Server estate to grow in the next 12 months. So the frequency of deployments is increasing, and the greatest number of respondents in that group actually deploy database changes multiple times per week, with almost a quarter releasing even more often. Most of the respondents also spent an hour a day looking at server health, and a further hour on top of that resolving issues. So generally, it came out that team size was quite small, consisting of around 1 to 3 people. But of course, security and protection is one of the biggest server management challenges that these small teams face in the coming years. So capacity can really cause a problem here. So with larger, more complex environments and an accelerating pace of change, understanding an environment is more difficult than ever. What role does monitoring actually play in this? Well, the answer is simple. Monitoring won't fix all of your problems, but whatever challenges you do face, it will make them simpler. With the right monitoring tool in place, for example, you can catch deployment errors, diagnose issues faster, and prevent them from recurring. This allows you to track and plan a growing estate and even catch unexpected or unauthorized access to your servers. So ultimately, whatever challenges you and your SQL servers face over the next year, consider including monitoring as a crucial part of that solution. So ultimately, this brings us up onto what we at Redgate now call our approach to compliant database DevOps. But how does this benefit the work that you're responsible for? And what are the overall business benefits to the healthcare sector? Well, it allows us to mitigate potential security threats. Many companies have actually embraced automation practices that enable and enforce compliance, security, and audit requirements. Today, companies in the healthcare service actually view DevOps as a resource for security as opposed to a needless change. We can automate all of our processes, which means that essentially through the delivery pipeline, we get another essential enhancing resource, and that helps us ensure that product quality and developer productivity. DevOps actually offers enterprises with an efficient approach to alleviate risk from their software releases and actually aid the ever-evolving demand for frequent application updates. This drives a cultural transformation. We focus on creating an environment and a culture where the business, operations, quality assurance, development, and other stakeholders work collaboratively towards a shared goal. Ultimately, they can optimize their technology and tools and scale DevOps adoption, which embeds security best practices, and automating the lifecycle becomes a major step. DevOps is a mindset, and any change in culture does take time. The implementation of DevOps is spreading rapidly in the healthcare sector due to the value that this global systems level approach enables. DevOps accomplishes this by scaling the latest IT process across the entire organization in order to enable an end-to-end robust pathway to production. So you're more able to easily orchestrate the work that all of your teams are doing, and doesn't mean that people are siloed into separate areas. Ultimately, it reduces our operational costs. Cutting costs through data governance can be achieved by eliminating duplicate processes and assets that aren't used, which decreases costs associated with poor data quality and reduces administrative costs by defining clear roles and responsibilities for this data management. So the benefits can actually also help to maximize profits of those healthcare organizations. Now, we saw earlier a bit of SQL provision in action, and this is kind of our new compliant DevOps model. Ultimately, we find ourselves in a position where we're able to keep an eye on everything, both in production and as it leaves production, by putting in place almost like a data firewall. This means that our developers and our testers are happy because they're getting realistic versions of production to work on. And our DBAs are happy because they're able to keep an eye on production, make sure that it gets on doing its job, and that all data is being protected as part of this whole process. Essentially, the key takeaway here is that by asking ourselves those four main questions we saw earlier on, we can actually be sure that we are doing everything we possibly can to protect the information that our end users, our customers, trust us to hold and look after. Now, there will be plenty of opportunities in the future for you to get in contact with us here at Redgate to pick our brains and to talk over some of the challenges that you face. Indeed, Redgate is hosting 3 exclusive SQL in the City summits in New York, London, and Chicago this October to help support senior database professionals deliver value quicker whilst keeping your data safe. We'll hear from industry experts as they discuss the challenges of DevOps adoption and share their experiences of how to successfully implement database DevOps across the IT team. The sessions are for anyone really, from C-level executives, directors, managers, database professionals, architects, and engineers who work on the Microsoft Data Platform. If you check out the website now and remember to use the code webinar, you'll actually be able to claim your complimentary ticket to any of these 3 events. Also, don't forget our free quarterly live stream, SQL in the City Streamed, will return on Wednesday the 5th of September. And the theme for this session is Adapt and Thrive as a Data Professional. The schedule includes sessions designed to broaden your skill set, support ongoing learning, and keep you up to date with what's new in the industry and, of course, here at Redgate. Microsoft MVPs Steve Jones, Kathy Kellenberger, Grant Fritchie, and Rob Richardson will head up the speaker lineup and will be joined by members of the team at Redgate and other technical experts, and myself as well. Check out the website for more details and to register your place. Tickets are going fast, so hopefully you'll get in there soon. So without further ado, that does unfortunately bring us to the end of today's webinar. So I would like to invite any questions that you may have, and we'll be able to tackle those now. So we haven't had any questions coming through. That's absolutely not a problem. Hopefully what we've done is actually answered all of your questions. That would be perfect. But if you do have any questions, then obviously you're more than welcome to get in touch with us. And you can contact us on dataprivacyprotect@red-gate.com, by visiting us at red-gate.com online, or of course by sending us a LinkedIn request, and we'll be more than happy to have a chat about whatever it is that you need moving forwards. Besides that, I don't think we're going to have any additional questions, so I'd like to thank you all very much for coming to today's webinar. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week.